Kate, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
You have a really, really cool job.
I'm glad you think so.
Do you think so still after 21 years?
Yes, I do. And I realise how lucky I am. But I sometimes I have to stand back. You know, you're caught in the nitty gritty of, admin or difficulties with specific cases, and you start to get frustrated, and then you have to stand back and go, like, how fortunate am I that I've been to 4 Olympics and I get to work with the best athletes in the country on a day-to-day basis. So I do realise it, but I do have to sometimes stand back and remind myself.
Yeah. So what does your typical day work like? And that can be boring, that could be admin-y. And what does your, I suppose, preferred day look like, or your best day?
I guess, like any job, I do have a mix of, admin and note-taking. But ideally, I'd have 3 to 4 consults on a busy day. I think any more and I start to get too fatigued to pay full attention. So that's probably about optimal. Or if not athlete consults, multidisciplinary team meetings about athletes or teams. That's definitely become a bigger part of the role working in the Sport Ireland Institute, that we're really trying to make every sport operate in that multidisciplinary fashion to provide really, really world-class service. And the goal with that kind of multidisciplinary teamwork is, rather than put out fires when they're lit in terms of someone's performance, you're actually predicting problems before they arise by sharing information between the nutritionist and the physio and the psychologist and the doctor and the coach. And so we're really aspiring towards working in that way. So that type of work has become much more of a feature than just the one-to-one athlete consults, which probably would have been more of a feature of the early part of my career. And the other aspects then, psychology probably doesn't travel as much as some of the other services like physio.
Is that a shame? Are you raging about that?
No, I don't mind. I did an awful lot of travelling at the start of my career, and you have to do it early in your career to just build up an understanding of the high performance landscape, especially if you haven't been an elite athlete, which I wasn't. And just being there, observing, understanding the culture of each different sport that you get parachuted into, knowing their language, their terminology. Travelling is the only way to get that. You can't really learn that stuff without it. So I used to do a huge amount of travelling. I do less now. I probably do maybe 2 trips a year to camps or and then a peak competition. But as the Olympics gets closer, the travel demands tend to increase as well, because the stress of every stakeholder in the system gets ramped up. So our role becomes more important.
Your role becomes calming everybody in the system down.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what we really have seen in the last couple of cycles is that if there's any kind of crack in the coach-athlete relationship or the manager-team relationship, shall we say, it can kind of be brushed under the carpet for a period of time. But if you apply pressure to the crack in that relationship, it can just crack open. And we do see a lot of breakdown of those relationships around games time or in the months leading up to the games. So a lot of the work tends to be, there is an emphasis on performance, but there's also an emphasis in trying to get people to collaborate and work together and trying to repair damage that's been done in relationships. So the type of work around the games isn't always just about performing at the games. It's actually trying to get people to the games with good, high-functioning support systems around them, with everyone working together.
Sometimes I wonder, about these conversations that can be had between a sports psychologist and an athlete. Wonder the depth of them. And I saw an interview with Annalise Murphy, talked about you going out with her, travelling with her, like you're talking about, getting, I suppose, exposed to that environment. And you pulled her aside at one stage and said, you have to stop chatting to people on the water. Is it as simple as that sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes you're just watching for things that maybe the coach isn't watching for, because they're looking for, tactical, they're getting wind readings and tide readings, and I'm just looking at her behaviour in the boat. And so you're picking up on small things like that, picking up in a dressing room that the team comes in at half time like full of energy, and they do their tactical chat, and the coach might say a few words, and then you realise they're going back out on the pitch in the second half quite flat because they've just been sitting still and talking. So noticing those little bits, and then having a word and saying, like, maybe the S&C could do like a couple of short sprints with them just before they leave the dressing room a little bit earlier to allow them to reactivate. So they're small things that the psychologist might notice that it's nobody else's job to notice. And we're just trying to find clues. Someone described it recently as being a detective, like looking for performance clues, because at real world class level, there's rarely one clear answer for underperformance. It's usually a myriad of small things that just aren't going right or clicking together, and you're the detective along with the other members of the team in trying to find the clues and piece them all together.
Do you ever find that you could be stepping on toes as well? Or not that you are, but somebody could feel like you're stepping on toes, like say an S&C coach as an example, would they be like, well, I'll look after it, I know what I'm doing there. Is there a bit of that to go on?
I guess it's how you word it, but also it's knowing where the limits of your expertise are. So I'm not going to be the one going, we need to increase the activation levels of the athletes. And I start going, let's get them out and doing some sprints and I'm running them, or, I'm giving them nutritional advice, or, I'm noticing someone's concentration is waning and we're looking at, are they, a clue might be, are they dehydrated or have they underfueled? I'm not going to give them the advice on how to refuel or rehydrate. I'll pass my observation to the nutritionist and see if they want to run with that observation or if they see another explanatory factor.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because sometimes I think about I don't know if you've seen the Tottenham Hotspur documentary, All or Nothing. Jose Mourinho was a manager at the time. Now, this is a physio, there was a head physio, became a sort of very funny character out of no fault of his own in the show, but it was because of Jose Mourinho, because when he came to talk to Jose Mourinho, his face would drop, he would look away. What does this guy want to talk to me about now? And sometimes I wonder then, in all these environments and the system that you talk about, like, can there be a bit of that then? Because I sometimes think that a psychologist, needs buy-in from the group of players, but also a management team. I wonder sometimes, do you ever encounter that then when the manager's like, oh my God, like, what does she have for me now?
Yeah. I think it's changed. Like, I remember some of the earliest roles that I had, the psychologist was viewed with suspicion often by the coach. And like, I remember a coach who was a national underage coach believing that the performance director had planted me in the program as a spy to feed back to the performance director, and like wouldn't allow me in the dressing room during meetings.
Wow.
And really viewed my role only as just talking to the athletes and not liaising with them in any way. So I think that level of suspicion has changed, thankfully, and there's also much more of an awareness of the fact that, like, coaching at elite level is a really, really hard, stressful, demanding job, and actually the psychologist has a role in supporting the coaches and managers to deal with that so that they're functioning optimally, because if they're getting burnt out and stressed, their behaviour then changes, they become erratic, and that impacts the team, the environment, or the athlete. So I think in the most high functioning sports I've worked in, I work as much with the coach in supporting them or being a sounding board for them when they're struggling with, making decisions. So the engagement has really improved as the years have gone on, for sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely changed.
So it was 2005 when you started, really.
Yep.
I take it the landscape was completely different back then. There's a story from 1996 when Niamh Fitzpatrick was in with Wexford, and I didn't realise the extent of it because I knew the Wexford hurlers loved her. They won the All-Ireland. Martin Storey mentioned her in his Hoganstand speech, but there was a story from Liam Griffin where he said there was loads of people at training because they were on this great run, but everyone was asking, who's Niamh? Like, what's she doing? And he said, you run on there and give Larry Murphy a leg massage. And she said, like, you would never do it now, but at the time she was part of the group and she was trying to sort of keep that buy-in as well, and she ran on and pretended to be a physio. As such, 2005, it was only 9 years later. Was there a bit of sort of hangover from that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it took a while to figure out how psychology would work in the institute, where, athletes wouldn't necessarily be comfortable to be seen talking to you or to be seen going into a meeting room, with you, because it would have been viewed that, there was something wrong with them.
Yeah.
I suppose society has evolved. So the acceptance of, mental health and wellness, and the need to invest time and effort, each individual needing to invest time and effort into that has increased exponentially. COVID definitely accelerated the understanding of mental health support, as well as, and that I think has had a knock-on effect into, well, if I need it for my mental health, why wouldn't I need it for my mental performance? So the stigma around it has definitely changed, and to the extent where nobody would be hiding in the shadows around performance psychology. We're probably not there yet with clinical sports psychology, which we also have at the Institute. But we're trying to even make that embedded more into the multidisciplinary team as well, that it's not just someone is going for clinical psychology because they have, really, they're in a really bad state. We're trying to make it more a part of the performance team, just the way medicine is or physio is. So, yeah, I mean, I guess psychology, and Des Ryan mentioned this in a recent podcast with you guys, that psychology is probably behind some of the other sports sciences in understanding where it fits in the system overall. Yeah. But we've come a really long way in the last 20 years. And I think probably where we're lagging behind is the training of young psychologists coming through and helping them to explain to managers and athletes how they can benefit the system, because there often is still a little bit of a limited understanding that it's just one-to-one support that happens in the shadows and doesn't feed into any wider system, that it's in a bit of a silo. But if it's done in that way, it's so much less effective than it should be. If it's, if there's more communication with other stakeholders and we're sharing information while respecting the bounds of confidentiality. Yeah.
Can I give you, it's probably too much of an open question, but if I brought you into my team tonight, how is that playing out? Like, what's the first thing you're doing when you come in?
Again, and I'll refer back to Des's piece around the National Sports Science Working Group. I was the lead of the psychology division of that National Sports Science Working Group for Gaelic Games. And one of the things we identified as a group of psychologists is that we need models of practice that fit for different levels of sport. So the bells and whistles is I come in and I sit in every team meeting. I meet every single player. I get to know all the staff. I'm observing training. I'm there on match day. I'm in the dressing room. That's the world-class level of support. But that's not realistic for a lot of teams. Even professional teams, it's not realistic to have a psychologist there day in, day out. So we looked at different models of delivery. So the most basic is coming in and doing a workshop around, psychoeducation, around goal setting, managing pressure, anxiety, using visualization, like the basics. Yeah. And that's a good starting point. But a lot of the time people come and ask for a workshop just because they're in a final and they want some advice. Like pulling an all-nighter the night before an exam.
Yeah, it's like a box tick in their head. Like,
where, that's pretty ineffective. Nobody's going to change their behaviour significantly in the week of a big final. So, but it's a good starting point to do some kind of intervals of education through the season if you have a relatively small budget to introduce psychology. Again, if budget is limited, I often think actually investing the money into the psychologist working with the manager can be really much more beneficial than just having a few ad hoc meetings with some players. If you have a very small budget and you only have enough for 10 sessions, I would put that towards maybe the manager predominantly and maybe one or two players who have specific issues that they need to work on, which can give good bang for your buck. And then I suppose there's kind of an intermediate level where you're doing a mix. You do workshops interspersed through the season. And then you might not meet every player in the season, but you're there for players to avail of and to come forward themselves when they feel they're in a bit of a performance dip or there's something specific they want to work on, or the manager might want someone or have observed something that they want someone to work on and they're referring into you. Which can be a tricky conversation for the manager to have with that player, saying, I want you to go and see the psychologist. But so there are varying levels of support. So to go back to your question, if you brought me in, I would have done a needs analysis before I ever came in to meet anyone in your, I would have probably met the manager. But then I would have figured out how can I fit into this system, what's appropriate for the level of sport they're at the development age of the athletes, and where can I give them the best bang for their buck.
What's interesting about the manager thing, because I'm going to hazard a guess, is the thing that you're presented with most, maybe in a team sport anyway, is anxiety. Is that... Performance anxiety?
Well, actually, the thing that even predates the performance anxiety questions is selection.
Okay.
That's always the predominant conversation in team sports.
Yeah, and actually we'll come back to that, but I was thinking about anxiety and then how that plays out as people play safe and they're not putting themselves out there, they're not making an extra run that they could. But I actually think a manager could unlock that as well, because a lot of that maybe comes from a manager's behaviour. Instructions might be different, but if you miss a goal chance, it's like, why did he not score? Why did he not put it over?
Yeah.
But actually, if a manager was on top of his emotions, then maybe that would free up the players to sort of express themselves a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're reading cues all the time from the people around us. So even if they're not verbally saying anything, if they're looking despondent on the sideline or they have their head in their hands, when someone misses a chance, that person won't take the chance the next time. Yeah. Because of the fear of the response. So.
And then they shut up once the person does take the chance. That's the other thing. They don't say well done. They just keep quiet then. But the selection thing is interesting. So I was going to ask you, do you find that sometimes if you do come into a team, is a lot of it just a dumping ground as well, where people just want to just offload a pile of stuff on you and they're not getting picked or this is going wrong? Yeah.
Very much so. I mean, sometimes people don't really come with even a specific performance question. They're just not enjoying it for whatever reason at that period of time, and they want to try and figure out a way out of that. I think the key thing for me around acting is that, let's say, the dumping ground is being really clear that I never have an influence on selection. Yeah. Like, I never have selection conversations with managers. And that's this, I suppose, to go back to the point of how the psychologist positions themselves in the organisation, it's a bit of a tightrope between being in the midpoint between the staff and the athletes in terms of trust. You can't be too closely aligned to the athletes because you'll fall out of trust of the management team, and you can't be too closely aligned to management or the athletes won't trust you. Yeah. So you're always walking the tightrope of correctly positioning yourself to be trusted by both sides, but to be relatively neutral. And definitely, if there's any sense that you have an influence in selection, you'll lose the trust of the players straight away.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering, are you ever tempted when you're working with someone and they're clearly making progress, or you clearly think, this person has a bit of stuff about them now? You're never tempted to go to a manager then and say, I think you should look at this guy?
I probably wouldn't do it in such a direct way. Like if I'm giving feedback to a manager, it's generally more general, saying like, this person is engaging really well and I feel they've progressed. How do you see it on the field? Or have you noticed any difference in them? So I can't say like give them a go because I think they're going to do a great job for you, because I'm not at training all the time either, potentially. So it's maybe more to say I've been really impressed with this person and the engagements I've had with them and how committed they are and how dedicated. How are they doing on the pitch? And so I might raise an awareness that person has impressed me, but I'm not going to translate that into a directive for the manager.
Yeah, you're a proud Cork woman.
I am.
I spoke with Paul Kerrigan. I was doing a lot of digging here, trying to get some information on
going
you.
Back in the history books there.
Unfortunately, it seems like you're good at your job and nobody had any real dirt for me to throw at you. But one of the things Paul did say is that it was 2015 that you were in with them initially. That was obviously a really good year, a year on the brink almost for Cork football, and got to the league final. And Kerry in Fitzgerald Stadium in injury time, 1 point up. And Cork hadn't won Munster, and there it is. Like it's there. It's in Kerry. Yeah. And Fionn Fitzgerald comes up with this outrageous kick. You must hate Fionn Fitzgerald now at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, I looking back 10, 11 years later, you realise what a significant moment that could have been for Cork football. And I suppose they were on the brink, and that, sent them in the trajectory going the wrong direction. And I think the hardest thing around that from my point of view, and one of the regrets I had in the aftermath, was we had a really short turnaround to play Kildare in the next round. I think we only had a week, and there wasn't really time. Like, I was living in Dublin and working with Cork. There wasn't really time to schedule in a workshop, but actually we should have just prioritised that to allow people to try and manage their mental recovery around the disappointment and go again, because like they didn't perform well against Kildare the following week. But I think I was a bit naive going, oh, they played well against Kerry, and that they'd be grand going forward. But actually, we should have addressed it more directly and maybe taken time out of training to do that. Sometimes I would rarely try and step on the toes of pitch time, but sometimes actually a meeting like that would be of way more value than running around for 60 minutes.
Was there a thing, and obviously it's relevant this year as well, was there a thing about winning in Kerry back then? Was that, like, would you be using that, or you'd have to address it? I assume it's not like you can pretend like that's not a factor, them going into Killarney and trying to win.
Oh yeah, like the last workshop I did with the team before the Munster final was home advantage, understanding what it was. What are the factors that lead to it? How do you mitigate against those factors? So we really addressed it head on and then how do we, what's our strategy for like managing the crowd, managing the ref? We were very well prepared for the environment and the cauldron we were going into. But
sorry, can you give me any of those strategies? Because was there anything in particular that you would have done to make yourselves feel more at home or to take that away from Kerry?
Well, I think what I was trying to do was demystify the idea of home advantage.
Okay.
It's just thrown around as a term, but actually what is it? Yeah. And generally, like, if I'm trying to recall, like some of it's just very simple, like environmental factors. You're not familiar with the dressing room. You don't get to sleep in your own bed, which probably wasn't the case if Cork and Kerry are close enough. But like, so home advantage isn't this big mythical thing. You can actually distill it down into, a couple of variables. Probably the biggest one that influences the outcome is the unconscious bias of the referee when the home crowd is behind the home team. So how do you do that? You just you don't get on the wrong side of the ref. You communicate clearly with them. You nominate a point of contact to discuss issues. Not everyone piling on the ref at the same time. So referee management was definitely one of the variables that we had discussed around managing that home advantage or away disadvantage.
That's really clever, because I can still see, like, and it's no fault of their own, it is unconscious bias. There was that research that was done before with Premier League referees where they played them the audio and they didn't play them the audio and like of the crowd and see how their decisions were impacted. But I even think sometimes where I'm watching games that refs, their pointing and their gesturing gets a lot more aggressive towards the end of a match because the whole atmosphere has been whipped up and they're sprinting where they weren't before, and they're just not as cool either. Like, why would they be? Because it's the last 10 minutes of a big game.
They're human.
Yeah, exactly. So that's interesting that you're trying to take that away, because that probably does then. Actually, it could actually get the Kerry crowd on the Kerry players' backs a lot more if they're not getting that bit of momentum from the referees.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about the sort of unregulated nature back in 2005, or maybe there was a lot more of it, certainly, back then. But it's almost full circle now in 2026, where there's things like ChatGPT. And I read an article recently of someone had turned, I think it was Saoirse Hanley, an Irish Independent, had turned ChatGPT, or I think it was Copilot, an AI bot anyway, into her financial therapist.
Okay.
Is there now an idea where ChatGPT or an AI bot is becoming someone's sports psychologist, or someone's using it for those reasons? And for example, I have a friend who actually has his trained to speak to him like Coach Taylor out of Friday Night Lights, and it has the same lingo and it's encouraging him, but it's giving him a kick up the backside when he has to.
Yeah, clear eyes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Clear
heart, and lose. Yes, of course. It can deliver knowledge. And I think we need to, in order not to be removed from relevance, like, we need to highlight the importance of relationships and the nuance of knowing when to apply interventions at different times and who those interventions might suit and who they won't. So that's the skill of the sports psychologist. Like, there's quite a limited number of psychological tools that you can apply to enhance performance, but the skill is individualizing them in terms of timing, individualizing, and even in terms of like what resonates with the athlete. So I give an example from years ago. I worked with this athlete, and like the coach would give him technical cues and they would just go out the window. They just weren't working for him. They weren't staying in his head. And then I chatted to him more, and he was dyslexic and just struggled to remember the cues, and especially if they were too many of them. And so we went to, and it sounds a bit like something you might do in Montessori school, but we went to metaphors for animals. So like, how do you want to present, if you want to be aggressive, like what animal is like that? If you want to be, kind of patient and biding your time, what animal is like that? If you want to be confident and proud. And actually, like, this was an adult athlete and we were using animal metaphors, but he remembered them in moments of pressure. And that's what was really important. He remembered, how, like, tactically how he wanted to be, or, from his body language, how he wanted to present, because he could remember the animal images more than technical cues. So that's where maybe ChatGPT mightn't quite have the same level of nuance or insight.
Because it's not able to individualize the person that they're talking to as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose they get to know the person if they keep feeding them information, but that's assuming the person who's feeding them the information is really self-aware.
Yes.
Which they're probably not.
Yeah, and if they are, they're probably less likely to need it as much.
Yeah.
As well. So, like, what? So your journey along the way, so I keep talking about 2005. I know then you ended up in UCD under Professor Aidan Moran. You did a PhD there.
Yeah.
You did did you do a master's in England, was it, initially?
Yeah, and there was no master's programme in Ireland at that time, so I had to go to the UK to qualify. Okay. So that was 2004, 2005. And then I was really lucky. I got a really good piece of advice from the course leader. I was in Brunel University, and I was saying, what am I going to do at the end of my thesis? And he said, go back to Ireland. Like, the market is flooded here with graduates. Go back. Ireland is underdeveloped in terms of sports psychology. Get in ahead of the curve. And I made contact with Aidan Moran, who was essentially probably the only well-known sports psychologist in the country at that time. And it was just really fortunate timing. He had just got funding from the World Anti-Doping Agency to do a study on the psychological traits or risk factors for doping. Yeah. And I had done my master's thesis on cheating and sports personship. And so there was basically a PhD ready to be filled. So I did that with Aidan for longer than I would have liked, maybe 5 years. But I also was lucky enough that not only did I have Aidan as a supervisor, I also, for my PhD, I also had Aidan as a mentor for my applied practice. He was doing much less consultancy at that point, and so a lot of inquiries, and he must have got so many inquiries as the face of sports psychology for decades in Ireland. He passed so many of them on to me and oversaw my work early in my career. So by the time I was finished my PhD, I was also ready to be accredited by the Institute, Sport Ireland Institute. And then I was kind of at a crossroads, and in the lucky position that I could decide whether I wanted to go down the academic route or the applied route. Yeah. And I chose the applied route. But that was really thanks to having access to Aidan for that long.
Yeah, and God rest him, Aidan passed away in 2020. Like, he was so well got, so well thought of, so highly regarded. Like, even up to then, was he like a mentor for you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even after I was, not under his supervision for my PhD, like, we continued to work together on an academic journal, and I would still contact him to meet for coffee if I was having a frustration with a particular sport or coach, and he was just such a wise sounding board. He was so even tempered. He had a great sense of humour, and he was so well read and ethical in his practice. I just couldn't have had a better mentor. I was really, really lucky.
Let's take a quick break. So, Kate, you have done 4 Olympics cycles. You've done 4 Olympics.
Yep.
Anyway, obviously one of them was impacted heavily with COVID, the Tokyo one. But I saw an interesting interview with you where you'd said about the importance of not getting caught up in the Olympic thing.
Yeah,
I never thought of before, because the reality, as you pointed out, you're working every day, and it's probably 16-hour days as well. I was chatting to Alana, who's producing this episode, about it, and she made the point that surely you wouldn't want to take away the Olympic thing either. If, for you and for the coaches and mentors, it's a big deal as well. Do you come away from the Olympics sometimes thinking, I didn't really take all that in or embrace it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first games I did more of that. Like I was so excited when I got the bag of kit, and I was sort of in awe when I got into the village, and you were looking around and you could see Usain Bolt, across the road, and I was in awe. But you also then you have to remember that in order to be professional and to deliver good service to the athletes you work with, you can't be giving energy to that. You need to give energy to them. So, I guess the bit that the message we always give to athletes is like, you're in work mode. Maybe go to the opening ceremony if your sport allows, if the schedule allows, enjoy it, absorb it, go into work mode, and then enjoy the Olympics when your competition is finished. Yeah. And, stay around and do the partying, whatever. Mostly the staff don't have the luxury of doing that because we're working right until the last day. And for 3 games, modern pentathlon is the last event on the last day with the marathon. So, you're working from the opening ceremony till the closing ceremony. And so to enjoy the Olympics in the way that the athletes enjoy it when they're finished competing, it's just not possible. You couldn't function. So I suppose you have to remember you're there in a different way than the spectators who are there on their holidays and the athletes who are there to compete but then enjoy themselves in the aftermath. You are there to work. And of course it's enjoyable and there's really cool parts of it, and it's such a unique experience. But also one of the other things that has surprised me most about the games is it's quite lonely. So you're in this village with loads and loads of people, and maybe if you're just there with one sport and one team, it's different because you're on the same schedule as them all. But when I was in Tokyo, I was working with 5 different sports simultaneously. So I wasn't on the same timetable as anyone. Yeah. I was on my own a lot, commuting from one venue to the other. You're in, you may be sharing a room, you may be in a room on your own. You do spend quite a bit of time by yourself, which seems weird in such a carnival atmosphere. And even other athletes have said that, where we tried to prioritise in Paris that athletes would get a room on their own and staff would share. But actually some of the athletes said, I was kind of lonely because I'd no one to talk to. I'd just go to bed early and be alone with my thoughts. And then I'd wake up and they'd be known to go for breakfast with. And you text people and they go, we've already gone. And so actually, again, I was quite surprised that individual athletes had a similar experience.
That's interesting. It's almost like a bit of an insight that I never would have thought about you, because it's such a buzz that comes out of the Olympics. The Olympic Village sounds like, unbelievable. But that's the reality of it. Then is there an aspect that if you're enjoying yourself too much at the Olympics, coach or athlete, that's not a good thing?
No, it really would not. It's not well received. I think if you're there we're there in service of the athletes. The term we had as a backroom team was shine in the shadows for Paris. Yeah. But if you're there using it to build your own brand and your profile and posting and getting followers, you're there on your own agenda, not the agenda of the athletes or sports you're in service of. So I think you need to be really clear on your values and your role when you go to the games. And there's nothing more off-putting for athletes and other staff to see a staff member putting themselves front and centre and almost standing on the podium, sticking the medal around their own neck. Yeah, it's something that would really damage your professional credibility if that's how you operated in that environment.
Wow. The social media thing is interesting, especially at the Olympics. I know you went back to UCD, did research in social media as well. You could probably talk to that a bit more, but is there a quandary now in this day and age where I'd say it's probably a bad thing, for athletes, especially team sport athletes, to be on social media, getting so much feedback, or maybe being distracted to an unhealthy level as well, maybe looking for followers or something. But at the same time, they're brands now as well, and it makes sense for them to be leveraging that too. It's such a contradiction that I don't know where we should be sitting on it.
It's really hard, and for that reason, I looked in the research and there's very little out there because, well, social media is evolving much faster than academic research can get published. Yeah. So there was some research out there on, maximizing your brand, for example, or some research out there on how not to get in trouble on social media when you're a public figure. Yeah. But there was very little on the performance impact of social media at major championships. So I partnered with James Matthews in UCD, in the School of Physiotherapy and Health, and it was a small study. We got some funding from Sport Ireland Research, looking at, like, firstly, the reasons why athletes use social media at competition, the potential upsides, the potential downsides, and then what's the best way to manage those. And we got the views of 9 Olympic athletes and 5 Olympic coaches, and try to, because the other element of it is that it's often a source of friction between athletes and coaches who are of different generations. So their view of social media and their engagement with it is quite different. Yeah. So to try and iron out those potential sources of conflict, we try to get a better understanding. And I wouldn't say we've necessarily achieved it, but like, it has evolved significantly. So London was kind of the first social media games as such.
Yeah.
And I remember Australia had like a rule of tweet or compete. Like, it was one or the other. So like, they had a stipulation.
The Australian team in 2012.
Yeah. They stipulated, like, tweet or compete. You can't do both. You cannot have those stipulations anymore. Yeah. Like, it's not reality. And there are upsides to social media for athletes: brand development, engagement with their fans, which is enjoyable and a source of social support for people, and obviously it gives them a voice for issues that matter to them. So there are very good upsides, but it's knowing when to put a limit around your accessibility the closer you get to performance that I think is the key issue when it comes to those major championships. So some of the kind of findings we had was that athletes make their circle smaller and smaller the closer they get to a competition.
And they do that naturally, do they?
They do it naturally, but some of them would actually, like, they turn off notifications. Yeah. Some would actually delete the app completely, so even the temptation to go on isn't there. One of the things that's been really useful, because it can be, it's a positive distraction. You're scrolling, you've a bit of downtime, you want to get out of your own head.
Yeah.
But if you're seeing content about your competitors, that's not a very positive distraction typically.
Okay.
So that seemed to be the biggest downside, was viewing competitors' content and then comparing yourself negatively and your own preparation. So one of the workarounds for that was to have a second account and follow non-sport related topics. So the algorithm throws up fashion or current affairs or arts and crafts or whatever you're into, animal videos. So you still have the positive distraction element, but you're protecting your performance by not viewing sport related content. That seemed to be a kind of good happy medium. Some other people wanted to maintain the brand building opportunities, so they gave their social media accounts to a trusted friend or relative to post on their behalf. So they didn't go silent during their competition, but they also weren't engaging with social media themselves. Okay. So again, we found some workarounds that allow you to maximize the positive elements of it and to minimize the downside, which is viewing competitors, seeing negative comments or criticism, and trying to reduce what you take in, or the risk of what you take in. Yeah,
because in terms of sponsorship as well, I suppose that's the peak of the exposure they're going to be getting if it's an Olympics, for an example. That's almost, it would make sense for them to be posting that time if you were just thinking about maximizing views and interaction, followers, and making yourself more appealing to sponsors as well. That's not why they're there, but again,
that can be a source of stress for athletes, because the rules around posting at the Olympics are quite different to their usual World Cups or Europeans. So even just coming to terms with that, and not, there's periods where they can't promote their own personal sponsors at the games themselves. So there are some issues around that can be sources of stress for people as well in and around that major championship.
And then, like, for these, as an example, 16-hour days, I know there's a lot of commuting and going to different events. But are you also then just available at all times in the hotel? Like, do you have scheduled meetings? Can somebody just knock on your door? Like, do you have to just be always on?
Well, it's definitely unsustainable to be always on. I guess, again, it tends to be relationship led. So the model that we found that doesn't work is just parachuting in a psychologist, having a clinic where people can come and talk to them if they don't have a pre-existing relationship with them.
Yeah.
And so psychology has evolved over the 4 Olympic cycles I've been in, where in London, like the headquarters psychologist didn't have an accreditation to come into the village. They were brought to London, but they were housed in a staff apartment that was a good bit away from the village, and they had no visibility, and therefore people didn't utilise them. So in the last games in Paris, the International Olympic Committee have actually stipulated accreditations for welfare officers who are there in a kind of safeguarding role for athletes and staff, but predominantly athletes. And typically those accreditations are used by psychologists.
Okay.
And so the visibility of psychology has increased significantly, and there's less pressure on the sports to use a coach's accreditation to bring a psychologist, because so the team size dictates how many you get. We had 2 for Paris. So it was myself and a clinical psychologist, Paul Gaffney, who were on site. But the key thing for, I suppose, how impactful our work was is that we were aligned to sports or athletes in advance of going. So the way you work is probably dictated by the level of accreditation you have. So can you go everywhere, or can you only stay in the village, or can you stay outside the village? So your visibility increases how much people engage with you, but also the quality of the relationships you have throughout the Olympic cycle, and not just for the 2.5 weeks of the games, dictates how much people want to engage with you at times of pressure or crisis. And the other thing that, historically we used to talk about, would someone, if they weren't accredited or they weren't going, would they hand over their athletes to me? But actually the advent of technology has meant, people can still use their psychologist who's back in Ireland through video call quite easily now and quite effectively, because that's how we work day to day as well. So the people, like, we're trying to reduce the amount of change that people experience at the biggest sporting event of their lives. So we try and really just stay working with the athletes we work with day to day, and we're there if there's any major crisis and the person doesn't have support on site. We're there to stand in and help with those.
I'm just trying to think, what would a typical example be? I'm still in this Olympic mindset, where the game's on, basically. It's happening. So what are you offering then? I'm sure it's loads, but what would a typical thing be that an athlete's coming to you with? Like, they're racing again tomorrow, they're throwing again tonight. Is it a confidence thing? Are they just looking to talk through something and say it out loud?
It varies. Like, sometimes people don't want to talk about the competition at all. They actually just want someone to get them out of their own head and go for a walk or go for a coffee and talk about anything other than the sport. And that's often my role on the day of competition. If you're trying to build up someone's confidence on the day of competition, you've left it too late.
The work's done.
I mean, so unless something they have, a major setback or something where you're, trying to talk them off the ledge, they're crying or they've become overwhelmed. Like, usually you're actually just trying to positively distract them and just chit chat and just be there, and be, be level, just be not too high, not too low, just be there as a solid presence. And trying to be reassuring.
You're an interesting one, because you've gone from talking about 2016 and being just following around Annalise and sort of more singular athletes and being more present and with them the whole time, to then becoming head of sports psychology. And then I imagine it's sort of the same in any walk of life. It's like, I imagine then you're taking on so much more admin, you're looking at structures and strategy, and probably going away from the really cool job that I called this at the start. You're more, so I suppose, bird's eye view on things. Did you find that a little tougher, that you're maybe coaching mentors in rather than athletes?
So I suppose part of the growth of psychology and the evolution of psychology was the need to have a nominated lead, a head psychologist. Before, there was just one psychologist. So when I started, I always say I was the head of psychology, but I was just the head of myself. As the team grew, there was a need to take on a more management role, and I love the mentoring other psychologists. I love that part of the role, but probably I enjoyed less the form filling and the all of the logistics and the strategy and planning and staff days and budgeting. I enjoyed that less. And as you have more staff, there's more of that. But it's such a good sign of the service and the industry that that's required. We now need a manager for the number of psychologists we have. But certainly it did take away from my ability to embed in a sport. And I noticed the more and more the management role increased. I remember going away with sailing, and sailing isn't a sport where you can get anything done during the day. You're on the water for 7 hours, and I came back and I'd have loads and loads of emails that needed a really fast response. So I was coming from 7 hours on the water to then having to do a few hours of admin, and I realised that wasn't really sustainable for me to continue to deliver service to the sports while also managing, and I had a pretty significant caseload at that stage. I think in the end I had 40 odd athletes competing in Tokyo while also trying to manage the team of psychologists. So I think the role, I stepped away from that role in between Tokyo and Paris, and I've just gone back to being a psychologist on the ground with the athletes.
Because you're double jobbing then essentially when you're doing all the admin, looking at coaches, mentors, but trying to be a service provider to athletes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's hard to do both. I think you need to have a quite a defined caseload or sport of athletes that doesn't just keep expanding the way mine did. But I think that's the way it's going in all the services in physio, nutrition, S&C. Like the growth of the elite sports system in Ireland has meant that those leadership roles have become more and more necessary.
Yeah, and I suppose you mentioned at the start the progression of athlete welfare then has become more important.
Yeah, I mean, again, nobody mentioned athlete welfare when I did my master's 20 years ago. It just wasn't a thing. And there was no module on mental health in my master's teaching. And I remember even I worked for 4 years with Rugby Players Ireland as a player development manager. And I remember one of our pillars was mental health. And like we were kind of awkward asking the players, like, how are you? Do you have any concerns about your mental health? It just wasn't like, that was probably 2012, 2013. It just wasn't a question that people were comfortable with. And so even being, we were never sure how to deliver that service of offering mental health support to players and now athletes in the Olympic system, but it has evolved hugely. Where now we have in the institute we have two in-house clinical sports psychologists who are quite embedded in our system and have relationships with many stakeholders. And then there's an athlete welfare manager who works through the Federation of Irish Sport, who again is, I suppose, a good sounding board for the athletes who have concerns, because what ended up happening was the athletes were coming to the psychologists with a lot of concerns around selection or funding or, issues like that. But that really jeopardised our ability to stay in that neutral position that I mentioned earlier, where you're trying to help an athlete when they have an issue with their with their governing body or their coach, and you're their source of support. It's very hard for you then to maintain your relationship with the staff in that sport. And that became increasingly difficult for the psychologist. So having an external welfare person who they can go to support them around those types of issues has been a really positive development. We just need more.
Yeah. And do you see that every day that you need more? Like, is that something that you would be thinking we could do a lot more?
Yeah, and like I know, like boxing recently appointed their own welfare officer. There's a welfare officer in rowing now. So some of our bigger sports are doing that themselves and recognising the need for someone who's positioned there in that as their remit. And we're behind other countries in that respect, but we've taken huge steps forward.
Yeah, you talked about 2012 there, and this is making me think of like what's the buy-in like then? People open up a lot more than they might have then. People are, I suppose, bringing concerns a lot more. When you're there, when you've met somebody, like what is the type of buy-in that you're getting from a group of people? Like, is generally, are most people on board with it? Are most people a bit skeptical?
Again, that's changed hugely. So I would say, and I remember years ago thinking, and we were, the common advice was you go in and there's maybe into a team, there's probably a third of people who are interested in what you say, a third who think it's nonsense, and a third who you can sway if you perform well. Yeah. I would say it's more weighted towards people are generally open and receptive to hear. And again, contingent on your performance as a psychologist and the value you add, are generally willing to engage. There are obviously some who say, I don't need it or it doesn't apply to me, but people typically aren't dismissive of it the way they would have been in the past, because there's just so much both evidence, empirical evidence, but just word of mouth of people, elite athletes and role models saying that they've engaged with it and it's helped them.
It sort of goes hand in hand, doesn't it, as well, with athletes, teams, even at club level, wanting as much support as they can get. So they know, like, psychologist is one of those jobs that feeds into an elite athlete. So if they're getting it at any level, maybe they are more receptive to it now, because okay, we're being looked after a lot more than we were last year, as an example.
Yeah, exactly. There's just their confidence comes from in investing in people and making them feel they have value. Yeah,
so you probably saw a lot of the talk around Conor Laverty in charge of the Down football team. We were written off as someone we've talked about on the podcast a lot. And it's not new in the GA. It's actually age old in the GA. I remember speaking to you 6 years ago during lockdown about the Last Dance documentary about Michael Jordan and his, it's a very famous line now. I took that personally. And how much can you actually use that? There's the best basketball player ever using the we were written off approach.
Yep.
Obviously, there's still something to it. If everybody's still using it, Michael Jordan was using it.
Yeah, like I think probably like any coaching tool, it's the using it judiciously at the right time. Like using it week in, week out, it loses its luster pretty quickly.
Okay.
And the same thing as like ranting and raving in the dressing room. If you do that before every match, people just tune out and it just becomes background noise. So it's a skill in coaching and management to know when is this going to hit a nerve and get the right response, versus overusing it when you start to neutralise its response.
Yeah. How effective are those changing rooms, ranting, raving? And again, it's probably cramming before an exam, but I do like an old Hollywood movie. I like the old pre-game speech. Does it have any impact?
I don't really think so. I think what can have an impact...
Kate, stop. Come on, you're breaking my heart
here. Sorry, I think the idea of like everybody doubted us and nobody believes in us, I think that can be a really unifying factor and create a sense of kinship with your teammates, going, we know something that nobody else knows. We know we're good enough. We believe in ourselves. Even if they don't, it almost aligns us closer to each other. I think the ranting and raving in the dressing room one, where it can be effective, is maybe at half time. If the team are flat, if you're not getting the work rate you want, not getting the response, and you just feel like they just need something to get them going. I think if you're using it sparingly on those occasions, it can evoke a response where people are almost surprised.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's the part of the pre-match speech before every match, it completely loses its effectiveness.
Yeah. And something else I suppose has come up a lot this year on the podcast is Arsenal are trying to get over the line here. Looks like they might well do in the Premier League, maybe the Champions League. Something's been thrown at them for the last 5 years. Is the bottler tag. It's thrown at them so much that it's almost... You're not allowed to say it anymore. Like, people feel that sorry on them, but it must be a bit of a thing too, right? Even if you think how dominant they've clearly been the best team in England this year.
Yep.
But there's been a tightening up of, I suppose mentally that's now sort of played out physically, and that's maybe natural.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I can, not dissimilar to the earlier example I gave about home advantage. Bottling is a really generic term that's thrown around. So actually, if you wanted to address it, you would unpick what that actually means in practice. What behaviours do we engage with? That people put that tag on us. Is it an opinion, or what are the facts around? So the facts are it's happened in the past, but what were the behaviours that led to that, and how can we avoid falling into the same behaviours again in the future? So you're essentially trying to figure out what aspects of it are actually real versus opinion, and then what aspects of it are real. So it might be like people are hiding, or people are afraid to take shots, or we become really defensive. okay, well, how can we reverse that so it doesn't continue to happen to us? We're not just a victim to the past. We can actually take control of things to try and reduce the likelihood of the same thing happening. So you're essentially just tracing it back to what are the behaviours you engage with when that's happened to us in the past, and what behaviours will we do differently next time.
So would it be effective to actually, if you're in the Arsenal dressing room, address a bottle in the past? So just say, look, we bottled this last year and here's why we bottled it and here's why we're not going to bottle it next year. Yeah,
I mean, I probably wouldn't call it bottling, but I would, I mean, but again, like that's something that you shouldn't be doing at the end of this season.
Yeah.
Like, that should have been done at the end of last season, where you have learnings. And, you know, I often tell a story about working with Annalise Murphy, where in the London Games going into the final race, she was in a medal position and she finished fourth. And like, it was really devastating for her and for all of us who were working with her. But she went through such a rigorous review process, hours and hours of reviews, and, you know, distilled down to a couple of really clear action points that she brought into the Rio Olympic cycle with her. And, you know, some of them were longer term projects. Some of them were, you know, around mindset around the finals. Some of them were lifestyle factors around being more consistent in, you know, her work day. Yeah. But actually what ended up happening was she was in the exact same position 4 years later. She was going into the final day of the Rio Olympics in a medal position with the chance of not finishing in the medals. She was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm here again. This is horrendous. And Rory, her coach, brilliantly had taken a picture of one of the post-it notes from the review 4 years earlier. And the question was, what would you do if you could have a do-over? And she had written on a post-it note in her own handwriting, I would see the opportunity to win and not fear losing.
Stop.
And it was there in her own words. So it was so powerful, the review process of learning from the failure and extracting clear actions. And like, she went out and, you know, she really attacked that medal race in Rio and sailed really well. But it was her own reflections that led to that. And the fact that the learnings were distilled down so clearly 4 years earlier that allowed her to race that way 4 years later.
Got goosebumps there.
Yeah, it was great. It was that post-it is up on the wall in the sailing HQ.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. I'd say Annalise stick stuff on the wall as well, because 10 years ago, after she won the silver medal, she was pictured with yourself and Rory. She said, basically, I was written off. She said people told her that Rio wouldn't have suited her.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about sailing, but she said it just, apparently people had said to her, this isn't water for you, it isn't an event for you. I'd forget about it.
Yep.
She wins an Olympic silver medal.
Yep.
So like, the only other, I suppose, little quirk like that I wanted to pick your brain on is there anything in the tradition of a team? Do you know, like, if you're doing analysis on a game that's coming up, one of the things you'll always hear is, but you can't write them off because they have a history of winning.
Yep.
And their history of winning might have stopped 10 years ago. But there is something, I think, that plays out in a team like that where they believe that we've got a long legacy of winning, so why couldn't we do that? More so than, I suppose, up-and-comers.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, what you're looking at is sources of confidence, and past performance is the most powerful source of confidence. But the further the time from when you were last successful, the less powerful that source of confidence becomes. But it's still there. But I mean, I think always the message we would give to athletes is you need to derive confidence from a whole load of different sources, from your training, from your past performances, from your belief in your coach's expertise and your tactical setup, from your teammates, from your physical fitness. So it's that history is a one part of many other elements of confidence, and it's important, right? But you don't want just to be relying on that, or just history to be the thing that derives your expectations for the future. What should derive your expectations for the future is where you're at right now.
Yeah. It's a nice segue into speaking about expectations for the future. You have 2 children.
Yep.
Are they sporty?
One is, and one is less.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That must be difficult for you watching on sidelines. You know, do you have to bite your lip? Do you feel like, you know, I've got advice that I can impart on their management team. I've got advice I can impart on them. Are they turning to you thinking you've been exposed to elite athletes every day?
Well, my husband coaches my son's soccer team, so
that must be especially
I'm in his ear a lot. And I suppose I don't like to be front and center. Like, I help out with my daughter's soccer team, and they're under 11s, and they just have so much crack, and they don't take themselves too seriously. And it's just, for me, it's about keeping them in sport for as long as possible and making it enjoyable. And, like, you know, whether they win or lose or wherever they finish in the league table is irrelevant if they enjoy it enough to come back each week. With the boys, they're under 13. It's getting a little bit more serious, and they have league tables. But again, I suppose the metric for success for me is retention, and that would be the main message for my husband is, again, I know you're not as high up in the league table as you would like, but, you know, the boys want to be there, they're coming back, and the results do influence that. But creating a positive environment and giving people opportunity to play and not sitting on the bench for 55 minutes of a 60-minute match, they're not things that will bring people back. Giving everyone a run, treating everyone the same, that may not be the pathway into creating elite superstars, but it's the pathway into creating people who love sport for life and don't fall out of the system. And that's the function that youth sport should have, especially in primary school.
Yes, success for an underage coach is really training. How many people showing up at training for you? Like, that's your feedback every week. You know, they want to come down, they want to be there. You're doing something right, whatever the league table says, like, that everyone keeps coming back. It's obviously a bigger concern, I suppose, with female sport and the drop-off rate there. Is there anything being done or can be done to try and tackle that?
I guess that's kind of outside of my remit from a governance sense, but I think it's not falling into the assumption that people only do sport because they want to win stuff. A lot of people, and I'm not being stereotypical, but like girls in particular, the reason they do sport is to hang out with their friends outside of school time. And so if the emphasis becomes on winning and competing, and not to say that there aren't competitive girls, there are loads of them, but making sure you create the right environment for what their goals are from sport. And if you create a really competitive environment for people who aren't actually that bothered about winning and losing, they'll drop off pretty quickly. So it's, I suppose, as a coach, being understanding of what's the thing that keeps the girls coming back, and not making the assumption that it's just competition. It seems pretty basic, but at the younger level, definitely the kind of opportunity to socialise and chat and do a few cartwheels.
It's an interesting one, because obviously you want your children playing for as long as possible. I suppose in your line of work, that lifestyle that you have, is that something that you would recommend as they get even older? I know they're very young now at the minute, but as they get older, they start thinking about what they want to do. Is what you do something that you'd be like, you know what, go for it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, actually, I get, as a slight related question, I get asked a lot, would I like my kids to be elite athletes? And it's a hard, like, I suppose I work in Olympic sports, which is predominantly individual, and it's a hard life. Like, it's hard to make it. It's hard to get on government funding. It's hard to make a lot of money out of it. But there are obviously a lot of rewards in terms of what you learn about yourself, the experience traveling around the world. But actually, for what people put in versus what they get out, like club level Gaelic games for me is like, it's such an amazing experience if there's a good team around, you know, if it's a positive environment, it becomes a sport for life. It becomes, you know, friends for life. You have an attachment to your local community. Like, that's a really important thing, to be established in a community and not drifting. I just see so much value in that level, that involvement, lifelong involvement in a team sport. Not necessarily at elite level, but at the level that's appropriate for your ambitions. Elite sport is a hard, lonely path, and there are really great rewards, but there are also there's quite a lot of risk associated to it. So I certainly wouldn't be funneling my kids straight into elite sport and say that's going to be an amazing future for them, because I'm aware of how hard it is. In terms of working in sport, it's great. Like, it's great to work in sport. Psychology, specifically as a discipline, has a very long way to go to make it, what's the right word? Like a clear, coherent pathway into the profession. I mean, we train loads of graduates to master's level, and then they're just thrown into a vacuum of there's no pathway by which they can get experience or supervision in Ireland. We're quite far behind other countries. And there are steps. There is the Irish Sport and Exercise Science Association is putting in place a supervision pathway. They have an accreditation scheme. Psychological Society of Ireland is kind of reinvigorated in the last year or so, and they're trying to run events to help people network. But it's a hard, lonely profession at the moment, because there isn't a pathway into which you can go in the way you can if you study law or medicine or physiotherapy, where you go into a placement with supervised practice. And that's really missing from our profession. So again, to go back to the advice I got from my university lecturer in the UK to come back to Ireland was brilliant advice, because I was lucky enough that I was already in a position to get work when it started, when the demand for sports psychology started to increase, because there were so few graduates. But now there's loads of graduates, but there's no coherent way for people to get experience, get supervised while they're getting that experience, other than through the UK system, which is not fit for purpose for the Irish landscape, given that the Gaelic Games are our biggest sport. So working in sport is great and it's really rewarding, but it's the profession of sports psychology has a long way to go to make it a really secure, viable career. I just feel I've been very, very lucky, and probably the starting point of that was having Aidan in my corner. Yeah.
So what do you have on today? What do you have on the rest of the week?
Well, I've a few golfers competing on tour. So I'm with, I think, 4 touring golfers at the moment. So there I'll be keeping an eye on their scores over the weekend. Again, golf is a tricky one to work in, because once they go from amateur to professional, they're essentially, I mean, they get some support from Golf Ireland, but they're sort of the CEO of their own career. And I never get to travel with them, for example, because they just don't have the resources to pay for a coach and a psychologist and a physio. So I'm looking at the scores on an app with no context for like how they were in themselves.
You know how busy you're going to be on a Monday.
Well, it's more you just have to word your texts really carefully, because you might see the score and think like, God, that was a shocker. But actually they're going, no, I didn't score well, but I managed myself well, and I'm kind of happy enough. So you need to be really careful with the tone of the messages and the language you use. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. And in terms of like, I don't have much travel on the agenda this summer. It's the kind of 2 years post games tend to be quieter. But the Sailing World Championships are in Dún Laoghaire in August. So it would be great to have a home competition and home advantage for our Irish sailors who'll be competing in that. So I'll be keeping a close eye on that one. And athletics, it's big summer for athletics, which is my main Olympic sport at the moment. So like, we always have the Cork City Sports, Morton Games, Nationals, but then we have the European Championships in Birmingham, and we have a huge number of Irish athletes who've qualified. And, again, it's not too far from being a home championships in Birmingham. It's very accessible. So I'll be keeping a close eye on that in August as well.
Oh, it's all go. Kate, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for coming in. Very interesting, very good to chat to you, and you're very good with your time.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Kate Kirby, thank you.